Wonderful. All right, so let's get into taking the exam. All right. I get a lot of logistical questions, so I'm going to answer a few of the common ones here very quickly. So I get, what type of questions are on the exam? Now, it's multiple choice, 160 questions, so there's no essay. And I've got some folks who are relieved when they hear that, and some folks that wish there was a writing part, but there isn't. It's only multiple choice. What type of, how long is the exam? 4 hours. 4 hours, and there's no breaks. The timer keeps going. So, common question. Where do I take the exam? So SHRM partners with an organization called Prometric. So that is a testing facility, and there are a number of them all over the world. So they're spread all over the place. Is it open book? It is not an open book exam. In fact, you leave all your personal belongings in a locker within the testing facility outside of the testing room. So a lot of security, right? Now, my next official question here, I'm going to go to you, Dennis, with this one first. You've taken these exams multiple times. What can you tell us about your experience with the exam and even the environment and what that was like?
Sure. Well, I take the exam as often as possible, sometimes even more frequently than necessary to recertify, because I want to stay current with the way in which SHRM is structuring the exam and asking the questions. Each and every time, it is a unique and new experience, even for a person who has facilitated the best practice content for 12 years. My most recent testing experience was June 1st of this year, June 1st of last year, rather, June 1st of 2018. I recertified by passing the SCP exam. I have the same experience every single time, and that is I get to about question 20 or so, question 25, and I find a need to push myself away from the cubicle for a minute and reflect. I know this stuff. I teach this stuff. I know I can answer these questions confidently, and nevertheless, it is a very rigorous exam. It's not unusual for HR professionals, including those of us that teach this content and read the curriculum on a regular basis, to not be absolutely certain about our selection of the correct HR best practice answer to each question. And so I have that experience every single time, had that same experience on June 1st of 2018. And so I began about 4 to 6 years ago to adopt a practice of orienting one's mental mindset in a way that prepares them for that testing experience, because it's not sufficient, my humble opinion, to know the HR best practices, the content knowledge, or be very, very familiar with the HR behavioral competencies. That's not sufficient. I believe it takes a mental mindset, different perhaps than the mental mindset that I carry around in my own organization, or as a 3 decades now practicing HR professional. I have to have a focused mindset that is thinking big HR, SHRM best practices, sometimes academically oriented best practices. In other words, I may not be able to implement that best practice in my workplace at a perfect level, but knowing that HR best practice certainly informs my practical practice of HR in the workplace. But I've got to have that absolutely best practice mindset in the testing cubicle, and I kind of sometimes need to set aside the practical way in which I might practice HR. And then that, last but not least, I would say, beyond the shadow of a doubt, this is an endurance test. And I always recommend to HR professionals that I work with, we must start with the end in mind. Right at the very beginning of the test preparation process, I recommend long study sessions, long test taking sessions, because until you go through that 3rd or 4th hour of For example, taking the pre-course assessment exam or any of the longer exams that are provided in the online SHRM learning system materials, until you go through that third or fourth hour of focused question answering, you really won't know what it feels like at hour 2 or hour 3 of your actual certification exam. And you do not want to be having that experience on your exam day, trust me. So I always encourage people to start with the end in mind. Focused intention, one question at a time. Practice with the end in mind.
Yeah, awesome. Absolutely, absolutely. You know, and you hit the nail on the head in terms of some of those questions and how we have to have a certain mindset. You know, whenever I start my classes, it's one of the first things I talk about in the very first night is how we have to have a best practices mindset. And so for those of you who are attending, you're probably going to hear that a few times, and you'll understand what that means even more so when you start taking those practice questions and you start looking at some of the answers. And so, you know, quickly, I'll turn to you, Cheryl, and you, Haley, if you have anything that you'd like to add before I get into my next common question here.
Well, I'll just speak briefly. So thank you, Dennis. That was just an amazing overview. And for me, coming from an academic background, I think it's important for folks to understand that this exam was compiled based on best practices from businesses, but also based upon research from 3 universities or 4 universities. And so the questions have been designed with a certain level of rigor in mind, not just from the duration of the exam, but for the challenge, the perspective of challenge and rigor. And they're continuing to evolve and fine tune, if you will, these questions. So among the 160 multiple choice questions that are a part of the exam, they're always testing what should become potential or future exam questions. Now, the good news is among those 30 or so field test questions that are included, they are not counted, they are not graded. Unfortunately, you will not know which ones are the test questions, but there should be some level of comfort from knowing that in there are at least 30 questions that are not being counted. So I wanted to encourage the folks about that. And then just to let them know, it is a very comprehensive exam, and that's why it takes 4 hours to go through it, because they're covering, you know, all 15 functional areas of human resources. And there's questions from all of those. And of course, there are areas that we're all strong in, and there are areas that we could really use some support to help find our way through those and to begin to understand and be able to apply those best practices. And that's where the HR Jetpack program, the SHRM body of knowledge, all of the resources that are available to you will help you be able to become more comfortable and strong in those areas in which you may not have the opportunity to work day by day. But the exam is about 50% each knowledge-based. Also, with respect to your ability to apply decision-making capabilities, behavioral competencies, in addition to the knowledge, it's about 50-50 or 60-40, depending upon your source for that information. So, if you're doing the work to acquire the knowledge, and we will support you to do that. And then through the scenario-based questions, you'll have the opportunity to demonstrate understanding and the ability to apply those. And we will teach you tips and techniques and tools that you can use to facilitate your ability to do that comfortably and competently and confidently. So, you know, that pretty much is how the test has been aligned to, and they have within those questions, even though the breakout would be about the same for the SCP versus the CP candidates. You know, the numbers of those breakup of those divisions of questions would be about the same for both credentials, but the type of questions will be a little different because, of course, your SCP folks are more engaged with strategy and the, you know, more of the strategic business operations, whereas your CP folks are more engaged in the functional and the application of the role and responsibilities day to day. So those questions will look a little different, but the breakout of those is about the same for regardless of the type of credential that you're pursuing.
Awesome. Great. Great. Thank you. Thank you, Cheryl. And I'm going to come back to you in just a moment, follow up for a sec. So just to ask you, Haley, if you have anything else that you'd like to add, or if you feel like Dennis and Cheryl have covered it in terms of the exam field.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that the two of them did a wonderful job. So I'm not I'm not going to take up any more airtime. But I'm glad that Cheryl did mention about the pilot questions, because that has come up quite frequently with me as an instructor. That, hey, what's the pilot questions about? You know, why do they even do them? You know, and so forth. So I think that you know, in a nutshell, they do them because it's a testament to how serious, you know, SHRM is about, you know, keeping up with relevant material and questions. And, you know, I know that they hire, you know, or actually ask for volunteers from the HR community on a yearly basis to go and sit on, you know, boards and look at the questions and really determine if the questions are relevant or not. So, but yeah, so that's it for that question for me. But, you know, great overview, Dennis and Cheryl, of that question.
Absolutely. Great. Yes. Well, thank you. And thanks for adding your comments too there. So, you know, I'll go back to you, Cheryl. So you hit upon the questions. You mentioned the pilot questions, and then you snuck in there a little bit and talking about the situational judgment questions, which might be new to some folks. And then the knowledge items. Sometimes they refer to the questions of items. That's a little terminology for folks on the line here if you're not familiar with that yet, but you'll see that word item in some of the content, and that refers to a question. So, I mean, what are your thoughts, Cheryl, on those situational judgment items? I mean, you know, a moment ago we were talking about best practices, and it's like, wait a minute, how do those two come together? What are your thoughts on that?
My thoughts are that is why folks need to take classes such as the ones we're offering to them, because there's almost a science behind how to interpret those questions. Competencies, and this is what SHRM is really focusing on, are competencies, right? So competencies require a combination of core knowledge that you need to be able to demonstrate that you have a base of knowledge, an understanding of certain best practices, and then the ability to apply that in a real world setting. So those questions are situational in nature, right? They present a situation. Now, there are almost always at least two answers to those situational questions that you can throw out right at a glance. They probably have very little to no application to the correct answer. But this is where it gets tricky. So they will narrow it down to about two responses that, well, you know, this is more challenging because they're both good answers. But what you will learn and what we will help you grow more confident in understanding is that there is a best answer that has been determined based on the best practices that have been incorporated into this. And so there's a lot of integration between the knowledge and if you look at the SHRM model, right, there's this wheel with all of these different areas and dimensions of knowledge, and they overlap and they integrate, and you will find the concept flow from one specialty to or one function to another. But by working with us and practicing, we will help you understand not only what is a good answer, but we will help you understand and be confident in identifying the best answer. And you will be able to then transfer the knowledge back into your workplace. And this reinforces the comments that we spoke earlier about the value of the certification, because it's not only that you are able to successfully pass the exam, but the expectation is that you're really acquiring the knowledge so that you can transfer it back into the workplace. And those scenario-based judgment questions will demonstrate that you have the ability to do that.
Awesome. Yeah, and it's just so interesting. You know, I'm thinking of, you know, the classes that I've had, and I've told people, I said, I realized that, you know, the 9 pounds, literally the package of 9 pounds that you get in the mail, that's actually something, those books, you can use them even for reference after the
Oh,
session.
absolutely.
You know, even though that you're thinking like, oh, like, I want to put that away. I did that for, you know, so many hours and studied hard and I passed. But yeah, and I have folks who I've had in class who have said, oh, I'm going to use this. I'm going to bring it home right into my office and use this as a part of our practices. So it can go beyond just preparing for the certification. So, I mean, you hit a great point there, Cheryl, you know, and I'll ask you, you know, Haley and Dennis, if you've got anything else that you'd like to add.
No, Dennis?
Yep. Well, absolutely true what Christina just said, and that is that the curriculum becomes a resource for years and years and years. Successfully passed your certification. So that's spot on correct. It's a great resource. There's a depth bibliography at the end of each of the 4 books. Very, very useful for years to come. And I would go so far as to say that every HR professional that I've worked with over these past 10 to 12 years feels as though they are a better HR professional from having gone through the test preparation experience and the testing experience. And that's, you know, I strive for 100% passing rate. I don't quite get there, probably in the 90% range. And I'll talk about that in answer to how to prepare for the test in a second. But even those HR professionals that come up short, are disappointed, maybe they wish they'd studied harder or whatever, they still come away substantially better informed HR professionals and thankful for the test experience.